What is today Latin America was once many native nations. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, and Danish all invaded. They carried out genocide after genocide and enslaved both natives and Africans. After independence, most new governments were still white-dominated, with more genocides against natives in nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. European powers hold on to some territories even today and kept invading to take their colonies back. The United States invaded too, overthrowing or trying to overthrow over 60 governments, the last attempt in the year 2020 in Venezuela. The U.S. also took half of Mexico's land and a tenth of its people, then Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There's a long history of many Americans fearing and hating Latinos. Latin America's image and reality is often one of instability, poverty, drug cartels, revolutions, corruption, and refugees. But it did not have to be this way. Latin America would remain all or mostly native nations. I spoke about this in detail in the previous series, What If Natives Won? Poverty, white domination, and foreign invasions could have been stopped, prevented, or limited. The U.S. could have been more Latino culturally, with higher numbers of Latinos. The U.S. could have been less racist, less dominating, or the U.S. could be defeated. Some Latin American nations could even become regional or world power. There's a huge lack of alternate history about Latin America and Latinos. So much alternate history is Europe-centered, mostly because so much history and history teaching is Europe-centered. This series is dedicated to scenarios, points of departure, and possibilities of Latin American victory within Latin America and a more Latino or less racist American society. My name is Al Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. My next history book will be Genocide Denial in America, about the 7 genocides against indigenous people that took place in the U.S. that most people were never taught about, don't know, or deny. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history. One story, Timely Saviors, appeared in a short story collection, The Witness Paradox. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Bluecorn Comics, editing and putting out a short story, alternate history collection, What If Natives Won? I've also written a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. America was white supremacist in its start and in its conception, and European wealthy males were made to rule, them only. But Latinos were actually classified as white even though most were mixed ancestry, and many were and are Native or African. Being legally white didn't stop white racism against Latinos. But for those who were entirely European ancestry, or thought to be, they have a chance to become American presidents, and then can fight against prejudice and laws against Latino people. Romualdo Pacheco was the Republican governor of California in 1875, and then a U.S. congressman. He was born into a family of wealthy landowners when California was still Mexico. At first he was blocked and then unseated by racist Democrats. Pacheco was strongly anti-slavery, but then he turned to being an anti-Asian racist to win over white racist voters. If he managed to become nominated for vice president, and then the president dies, Pacheco would have been a strong civil rights supporter for Latinos and blacks, but demanded Asians be kept out of America. Octaviano La Razalo was New Mexico's governor and then a U.S. senator in 1928. As governor, he had built into the New Mexico Constitution the rights guaranteed by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that they shall be preserved. Teachers in public schools use both English and Spanish languages. When he became a senator, he was already elderly, dying shortly after. If he had been able to be the vice president for Harding in 1920, he'd be president when Harding dies in 1923. As president, La Razalo would stand up against the power of the KKK, 100% Americanism, and waves of hatred at immigrants. He might break the hold the KKK had over 24 state governments. The most important thing he could do is block the Immigration Act of 1924. The new law favored white immigrants and almost completely blocked African, Asian, Latino, and Mideast immigrants. Without that law, America is not as white or as racist. Dennis Chavez was a Democratic New Mexico senator from 1935 to 1962. If he had been the vice president for Franklin Roosevelt or Truman, the New Deal would go even farther. Social Security would not exclude most farm workers, who are mostly black or Latino. The U.S. is more likely to go to war against Germany and Japan sooner. Chavez was strongly anti-communist. He will still fight the Cold War. but he was also anti-McCarthyism and would work to end that wave of hysteria, especially its attacks on the civil rights movement. Joseph Montoya was a New Mexico congressman and then a senator from 1965 to 1977. If he had been vice president for Kennedy, he'd be president during the civil rights struggles. If he was vice president for Lyndon Johnson, he might get elected on his own against Nixon. Montoya was strongly anti-communist and favored the Vietnam War. His presidency would face in the beginning much the same problem as Lyndon Johnson's over the Vietnam War. But by 1971, he had called for that war's end. As president, he might get American troops out of Vietnam sooner. Edmond Badillo was the first Puerto Rican to possibly become US president. He was a Democratic congressman in New York in the 1970s and also became mayor of New York City. Had Jimmy Carter chosen him as vice president, he would run the 1980s against Reagan. Their only chance of beating Reagan would be had the Iran-Contra scandal happened during the election campaign, or had Reagan died from assassination and Bush Sr., G.H.W. Bush, become the president. Badillo was a civil rights proponent and a Vietnam War opponent. He would have recognized the fall of the Soviet Union sooner than Reagan. Henry Gonzalez was a Democratic congressman from Texas from the 1960s to the 1990s. He actually ran for president in 1988. Again, if he'd been the vice president of Lyndon Johnson or Carter, that's the likeliest way to become president after those presidents are out of office. Gonzalez was anti-war, so he is likely to beat Nixon in 1968. The Vietnam War is over sooner, likely in 1969 or 70, and millions of lives will be saved in Vietnam, Cambodia, with no genocide in Cambodia and less of one in Bangladesh. If Carter's rescue of the Iran hostages succeeded, he's re-elected in 1980. Gonzalez likely wins against Reagan or Bush in 1984, and Henry Gonzalez would then be the president remembered for the end of the Cold War. Henry Cisneros was the popular mayor of San Antonio and also almost became the vice president for Walter Mondale in 1984. He later joined Bill Clinton's cabinet and then resigned when it was revealed he bribed his mistress to keep quiet about their affair. If he avoided this scandal, he could become president anytime from 1988 to 1996. Cisneros was a moderate compared to Henry Gonzalez and very pro-business. It would be a presidency much like Clinton's was, except for being the first Latino president. Bob Martinez was the son of Spanish immigrants and the first Latino governor of Florida. He was a Democrat before switching to a Republican, a strong environmentalist, but also accused of favoring high taxes. He also was strongly anti-abortion and in favor of anti-obscenity laws and censorship. And while governor, he tried to execute as many prisoners on Florida's death row as possible. Reagan appointed him the drug czar. It is certain, had he become president in the 1990s, the drug war continues. The death penalty is more widely used, and Martinez would try to restrict abortion. Antonio Villaraigosa was the mayor of Los Angeles in the 2000s and a Democrat. He was popular for improving education and traffic, but controversial for an Herbalife pyramid scheme and an extramarital affair. If he had avoided scandals and run in 2008, he could well have the same support that centered around Obama, as an articulate, young, and the first person of color to likely become president. It's likely his president wouldn't be much different than Obama's, including racist conspiracy theorist arguing he wasn't really American. Rafael Cruz, or as he calls himself, Ted Cruz, is Cuban ancestry, but born in Canada. After Trump, he was the second most popular Republican in the 2016 primaries. Had Trump not run, it's quite possible Cruz is president. The main thing against him is that he has an incredibly unlikable personality. He is shrill. He is prone to spouting conspiracy theories and nonsense of all kinds. And there have been some public events where it's clear that even his own children don't seem to like him. He would technically be the first Latino, but he has almost no Latino support and is widely perceived to have no identification as Latino. Cruz is not simply conservative, he's hard right or far right, almost as much as Trump. And he is likely to have had just as disastrous a presidency. Ironically, Trump himself would likely campaign against him and accuse him of not being an American with birther conspiracy claims. Marco Rubio is another Cuban-American Republican senator who ran for president in 2016. Unlike Cruz, Rubio actually identifies as Latino, and he has ties to the culture, including being very anti-Castro, anti-communist, and anti-Bolivarian in the anti-Venezuelan and the Bolivarians. Rubio is a conservative, but he is not an extreme racist like Trump. He is not a conspiracy nut like both Cruz and Trump. His time in office would be more like Bush Sr. or Reagan. His response to COVID would avoid the huge death toll that Trump caused. And even Cruz would have had a better time handling COVID than Trump would. Cruz initially promoted a scientific response to COVID. He only turned to COVID denialism and conspiracy theories to win over Trump followers. Julian Castro is a Mexican-American Democrat and an Obama cabinet member. In 2016, he was considered as a vice president for Hillary Clinton. He ran for president in 2020 and then endorsed Elizabeth Warren. Had Hillary Clinton or Warren won, Castro will have a strong chance to be president in 2024 or 2028. Castro is only slightly liberal, but expect hysterical racists and conspiracy theorists to call him not American, communist, Muslim, and radical, much as they did Obama. This is the end of the video and the end of the series. Repost freely, like, quote, and comment. This has been Latin American Victory. Look for a future series, Pacific Victory, and previous series, What If Natives Won, and Sci-Fi, Race, and Racism.